then.
Yes, I will. There we go. And then for a few minutes of questions, we'll keep the recording going, and then I will stop the recording. So if there are any questions that you don't feel comfortable being recorded, just hold those for a few minutes, and I'll stop the recording, and we can keep going. So with that, I'll let Tyler share the screen and whatnot, and go right ahead.
Thank you. Okay. This and I gotta put it in presenter mode before I share it. Alrighty, am I sharing the right screen here? You can see my slides.
Yep.
Okay, let me minimize everybody real quick. All right, very good. Okay, so today's talk is my most recent publication, which is actually a combination of my master's thesis and Morgan's master's thesis from our time at Cal State San Marcos before I got landlocked in the great state of Nebraska. So I hope you guys get all excited, as much excitement as I do when I talk about surfing. So I'll start out with a quick introduction or outline. So I'll talk about how wetsuits work, the problems with them, and how they can be improved. And then we have two questions we want to answer, and we'll see how we answer those questions by the thermoregulation and biomechanical experiments, and then we'll wrap it up with an AMA. So how do wetsuits work? Well, on the right-hand side here, you have your typical full suit that's going to be used throughout most of the year by all surfers, depending on their geographical location and where they're surfing and water temperature. And all these wetsuits have three layers, with the external layer being the black that you're seeing here, and that's to provide protection of the middle layer from any cuts or abrasions. And then the neoprene layer is actually the middle layer, which is the windproof and waterproof layer, and that's providing your first barrier of insulation. And then the internal layer is a fleece-like material that's going to protect the skin from any chafing or abrasions and from any contact with the neoprene. And these wetsuits are 2 to 6 millimeters thick on average, but sometimes they can be even more in really cold waters. And the main function of these wetsuits is to provide warmth for the surfer during all conditions. And so this is done by using 2 layers of insulation. And so the most obvious layer is the wetsuit itself, which is going to separate the skin from the ocean. And there's actually a little area of space between the wetsuit and the skin itself that will be trapped or fill up with water that becomes trapped. It gets heated by the skin, and we like to say that that's the second layer of insulation. And so what are the problems with wetsuits? Well, for the past 70 years, all wetsuits have been using neoprene, otherwise known as polychloroprene, which is a petroleum-based synthetic rubber with high tensile strength and stretch, as well as resistance to temperature, water, and deterioration. And you can imagine that because it has good resistance to changes in temperature, that it's a good material for surfing and other water sports. However, deterioration with the wetsuit is also a big problem and is basically the major con with the neoprene materials. Because you can imagine it's really hard to recycle synthetic rubbers compared to organic rubbers or any other material. And you can imagine that a surfer who's been using their wetsuit for many years or many sessions will throw their wetsuit out, and that might be sitting in a landfill and is unable to be recycled. There's also many health hazards when handling these materials when you're manufacturing them. So for the fact that it's a carcinogen, it's very flammable. It can cause tumors in rats and other animals, and it can cause death in some cases for the workers handling these materials. And so what we're seeing today is old wetsuit designs using old materials. Basically, for the past 70 years, we've only used neoprene because that's what we know is best. And as surfers, we rely on the environment and the health of the environment in order to provide our entertainment. And so it's important for us to repay it back and provide and create new alternative materials that can replace neoprene. So how do we improve wetsuits? Well, one of the two options is wetsuit design from the manufacturer and the surfer's perspective, with surfers having the option of wearing different accessories such as booties, gloves, and hoods that will allow you to surf in cold water environments that might actually be very hostile, such as Antarctica or Nova Scotia. And from the manufacturer side, we can increase the thickness of the wetsuit, and this will come with increased thermoregulation and skin temperature, but a decrease of mobility or maybe our perception of decreased mobility. And so you can imagine you have the guy here on the left, he's wearing his 2 millimeter wetsuit. Maybe he's a little cold, but he can move freely and he feels like he can surf to the best of his ability. However, as we increase the thickness of the wetsuit to maybe 3, 4, or 5 millimeters, we feel like we can't move at all. However, we're getting nice and toasty and warm under our wetsuit. And what we see with our previous literature is that we can actually circumvent this by doing some minor modifications. However, this can only be increased so far. You can only increase the thickness of the wetsuit so much, whereas it becomes too cumbersome, or maybe you're having diminishing returns on skin temperature. And the results of our studies will actually support this. And so the other option is, because we can't just keep increasing the thickness of the wetsuits, we have to look at different wetsuit materials. And so what we've done is we've done interventions in the outer layer as well as the inner layer that I was talking before. And for example, if you change the outer layer to a slick-like neoprene compared to the jersey material that we see in all standard wetsuits, we actually find that we can increase skin temperature over time for an hour-long session, whereas we typically find skin temperatures that are decreasing through the entirety of a session. But today we're just going to focus on the middle layer, which is the thermoplastic elastomer, otherwise known as TPE. And so this alternative material has the thermal properties of a thermoplastic with the flexibility of a rubber. And from the manufacturer's perspective, it has reduced cycle times, cost, and energy, which is beneficial for them because it makes more sense to produce wetsuits that are cheaper. They can cycle them out faster, and maybe they'll be better and more cost efficient. And then from the environmental impacts, it's potentially a better, or it has a lower carbon footprint than neoprene, and we can recycle this better. Again, I was talking about how you have a neoprene wetsuit that might sit in a landfill. However, the TPE wetsuit might be able to be melted down, as we see in other TPE materials, and then reshaped and reformed into alternative wetsuits, or maybe even other products. And so our two questions to answer is TPE warmer than neoprene? And does TPE change any paddling kinematics or kinetics compared to neoprene? And if so, are these differences recognized by our surfers? And so in order to say that an alternative material is a valid replacement for neoprene, there's kind of three options that we need to look at. And so the physiological and biomechanical responses should be equal to or better than neoprene and provide warmth without increasing energy expenditure, impeding range of motion or mobility, or negatively affecting padding performance. So we're trying to design a wetsuit of an alternative material that is the same thickness as neoprene, but is providing equal to or better performance in terms of skin temperature and flexibility and range of motion. And in addition, we should see no perceptual differences between these materials. So we recruited a convenient sample of San Diego County surfers that were between ages 18 to 50. They had at least 5 years of shortboarding experience and could fit into a medium or large wetsuit. You can see that for our two experiments, the thermoregulation had 18 participants and the biomechanical assessment had 17. These are actually different sets of participants. We could see that in terms of height, mass, age, years surfing, and competency, they're basically exactly the same. And what's important about the years of surfing experience is that because they have an average experience level of 12 years, they should be able to finish our paddling protocols and actually perceive any subtle and slight differences in terms of skin temperature and flexibility and mobility between our wetsuits, which is great for us. And so the thermoregulation part of the experiment, or part of this paper, was actually done by Morgan Simmons for her thesis. And you can see the 2 millimeter wetsuit on the right-hand side here. We had a few of these that were switched between neoprene and TPE on each side. And so either one side was entirely neoprene and the other side was TPE, or it was swapped. And you can see a cross-section of these wetsuits themselves. So they had the same 3 layers, with the inner and the outer layer being a jersey-like material. And then the middle layer that I was talking about before is either entirely TPE or entirely neoprene on the respective sides. In order to measure skin temperature for her study, we looked at, or we placed thermal eye button sensors on the torso, the arms, and the legs. And these are what they look like on my arms from a different study that we did. So these locations don't reflect what we did in Morgan's study in the lab, but I'll show the exact locations during the results section. And I just wanted to show that they're basically nickel-sized little sensors that were held in place by clear Tegaderm film, and they're basically imperceptible to the surfer, and you really can't feel them while you're paddling. And so we threw our subjects in a freshwater pool, which we call the flume. And so you have your surfer laying down on their board here, and the jet will push water against them while they're paddling. And you're probably thinking at this point, I'm just talking about paddling. You might be thinking, oh, that's not surfing. What about riding the wave? What about doing turns and airs and all that fun stuff that you see in pictures? And well, that might be a valid concern because we actually aren't testing wave riding itself. And what's unfortunate for us surfers is that only consists of 4 to 8% of a surfing session during an hour-long surfing session. And the rest of that time is split pretty evenly between paddling and sitting and laying down on the board. And so we try to reflect that in our protocol during our lab-based settings. And so we had our participants starting by sitting on their board. They would duck dive, which is just submerging themselves in the board underwater. They would paddle for a minute. They would lay down on the board for a minute. They would duck dive again and do an additional minute of paddling and then sit on their board for a minute. And so they repeated this process for an hour and for an hour-long session, with increasing in speed at every 20 minutes from 1.2 to 1.6 meters per second. And to put that in perspective, that's about 50 to 60% of your maximal paddling speed in the water. So the freshwater pool was set to a temperature of 16 degrees Celsius, and this is just slightly warmer than what we see in Southern California during the winter months. And the benefit of the study was that it was actually double-blinded, so we didn't know which side was neoprene or TPE, and neither did the surfers. So we were able to test any perceptual differences between flexibility and warmth under our different materials. So we'll move on to our results. So on the x-axis, we had time in minutes, and on the y-axis, we had degrees in Celsius for skin temperature. And you can see that at all time points, basically at all our locations, the TPE in black is always colder than the neoprene in gray. We find significant differences between our materials at the upper chest and the lower arm, and no significant difference between our materials at the upper back and the upper arm. However, this changes as we move on to the lower body, where we see significant differences between our materials at the lower abdomen, lower back, lower leg, and upper leg. And at all time points, the TPE material is colder than the neoprene. And what's interesting about this data is when we looked at the perceptual choices between the materials in terms of skin temperature, our subjects actually weren't able to perceive any differences between our materials, even though they had differences upwards of 1.8 degrees. And this is actually contradictory of what we see in other literature that we posted in to be specific, the slick neoprene. They had differences at 1.5 degrees Celsius, and those can be perceptible. And we think that's because of the location of the alternative material, whereas in the upper back, it's having less interaction with the water and more direct contact with the skin, whereas when you're having your legs underwater or your whole body underwater, the water is preventing you from perceiving any differences. And so to put this in perspective, we have a lot of previous literature that that shows that there's heterogeneous heat loss throughout the body when we test different alternative materials, when we're looking at commercial wetsuits that you can get off the rack. And this also exists between men and women, as well as the lab and field-based studies at the beach. And what we're seeing here is that during an hour-long surf session, say in the upper back, you're losing only 1 to 2 degrees Celsius in skin temperature, whereas at the lower legs, such as the thigh and the calf, you're losing upwards to 7 to 8 degrees in skin temperature. And this is actually a function of surfing and paddling itself, whereas when you're laying on the board or when you're sitting on the board, the lower half of your body is always going to be submerged, whereas the upper body is going to have less interaction with the water. And so we think this is potentially the reason why we're seeing no significant differences in the upper back and upper arm, and that's because it's having less interaction with the water compared to the lower body, where we found significant differences. And what we're seeing here is that this also might be the cause for the lack of perceptual difference in thermoregulation. And then finally, this has also been our recommendation for surf companies for the most recent years, is you should be increasing thickness in the legs where thermoregulation is needed the most, but keeping it thinner in the top, maybe keep it at 2 millimeters in order to promote mobility and flexibility. And I forgot to mention before that there was no perceptual difference in the flexibility between our materials, and the biomechanical section will actually support that, which is what we'll start now. So this was my master's thesis. The cross-section of these wetsuits is exactly the same, but the function or their makeup was a little bit different, with the entirety of the wetsuit being either neoprene or TPE itself. So we basically threw all the equipment we could at this topic, or at least for my part of the thesis. So we equipped them with a heart rate monitor. We put 7 EMGs on the right-hand side of their body, and we used 8 cameras to record 21 reflective markers on both sides of the body. And then finally, we hooked them up to a metabolic cart. And this weird contraption you see here that he's laying on is a modified swim bench ergometer, which is basically just a rowing machine to help us simulate paddling on dry land. Because you can imagine, you can't really put EMGs in the water. Well, we can, and we've done it before, but we couldn't really do motion capture, and we didn't have any IMUs that were waterproof. And it could be a little risky to put electronic equipment in the water without any backup plans. And so for brevity, I'll just state now that there's no significant difference between our materials while wearing the heart rate monitor. There's no difference in muscle activation, and there's no difference in oxygen consumption. And then the 3 trials that we had them undergo were 7 minutes in duration, and they were randomized between neoprene, TPE, and board shorts, with the board shorts condition being our control condition, which is just paddling in your swim trunks with no shirt on. And we gave them 30 minutes of rest between each condition. We had them hold a cadence of 40 strokes per minute via a auditory metronome and maintain a power output of 20 watts. And they can actually see their live wattage as they're paddling. And so what I'll do for this section is going to be a little bit shorter, is we're just going to focus on one figure because I think this is the most important part of the biomechanical assessment. So we have the wrist trajectory, the horizontal wrist trajectory in millimeters on the x-axis and the vertical trajectory on the y-axis. And you can see here, this is the start of the stroke as the wrist or the hand would be entering the water. You can see the hand comes down during the propulsive phase of the stroke and ends up down by the knees and the legs, where it begins the recovery phase of the stroke and begins to enter the water again for the next stroke cycle. And you can see that basically at all time points, there's no significant difference between the neoprene, TPE, and no wetsuit condition in terms of the kinematics. And this is also reflected when we looked at we looked for differences in average peak height and minimum height, as well as stroke length, width, and height. And so this is really interesting because this is actually confirming that there's no perceptual differences in flexibility or any kinematics in Morgan's study. And what this is also telling us is that when we were talking about the dichotomy of increasing skin temperatures by increasing the wetsuit thickness, but this comes at a decreased cost of mobility, this might not have to be a concern for surfers. And we're pretty superstitious, and we always think that change is bad. And so what this is telling us is that as you transition from board shorts to wearing a full suit, maybe we don't have to be as concerned about how much we can move around the water, because that might not exist. There might not actually be a difference. And really, we need to focus on maintaining our skin temperatures throughout this session for maybe an hour or even longer. And so I'll move on to our verdict. So from the thermoregulation perspective, maybe we can't consider TPE as a valid replacement for neoprene for the fact that TPE was always colder than our standard material at all time points and at all locations. So it might be hard to implement it commercially. However, from the biomechanics of our study, we did find that there was no significant difference between our materials, which is great. And so that kind of fulfills one of our 2 hypotheses or our questions. However, in the broad picture, it might be hard to implement this commercially because we're not fulfilling both of our options. And so it might be hard to convince producers to transition from a TPE material or to a TPE material compared to a neoprene material. However, I list 4 different options that we could use in the field. With the first option being surfers surfing in warm water. You can imagine surfing in the summer years, you don't have to maintain your skin temperature as much. And so the function of the neoprene wetsuit and a wetsuit top here would be to protect from exposure from the skin, protect exposure from the sun on the skin. It could also be board specific. So you can imagine a long boarder is going to be sitting up higher in the water compared to a short boarder. So maybe they don't have to maintain their temperature, and therefore a TPE wetsuit could be more beneficial. You can look at professional surfers who are only surfing for 35 to 45 minutes during their contests. And depending on their location, they might not need as much thermoregulation or have to worry about it as much as maybe in the dead of winter, maybe in South Africa. And so neoprene could be obsolete in that sense. And then finally, we could do a mixture of what we've done in the past with TPE and neoprene. So again, I was talking about how we can increase the thickness in the legs to maintain skin temperature where we're coldest. But in the red here, maybe we can transition into a TPE material because it's better for the environment and we don't have to maintain skin temperature as much. And so I'll move on to some quick acknowledgements. The first 2 are for Dr. Jeff Nessler and Dr. Sean Newcomer for facilitating a great relationship with Hurley, who provided our wetsuits. And then the rest of our authors, Dr. Matt Schubert, Morgan Simmons, and David Gomez. And then, of course, the undergraduates that helped us collect all of our data. So we'll wind down, we'll get more casual, some references, and then the Ask Me Anything section. And so mine is actually focused on what we can do to help others rather than what we can do to help ourselves and progress ourselves. And it's basically focused on starting the research career earlier in your education. And so I think this can be done by integrating curriculum with research as well as creating lab assignments. So what we did as extra credit, or actually the course grade, was helping or having undergraduates collect data for master's students. And I think that gives you the beginning stages, helps you get exposure to the beginning stages of research, specifically at the methodology and data collection aspect. But for us as PhD students, or maybe even master's students, it gives you an opportunity to recruit undergraduates and manage your own little mini lab team. So it gives you a good perspective on how you can help others maintain their strengths and diminish their weaknesses, as well as it gives you a good perspective of what your advisor is going through, who might be managing a bunch of undergrads, masters, PhDs, students, and maybe even a postdoc or two. And really, this is all just getting students to publish earlier and often early in their career. And so all these things led to me being fortunate enough to take 2 studies from inception to publication by the time I started my master's degree. And I think that really helped with my transition from undergrad to master's to PhD work. And I think it would be really, really beneficial to help other graduates out and get early exposure for them. So to conclude it, maybe we can have a little brainstorming session and how we can help other undergraduates and other early career researchers in being better scientists. And I thank you for listening.
Fantastic talk, Tyler. That was very, very good.
I'll stop sharing. No, I won't stop sharing. I'll try to get
Yeah.
your faces up.
Yeah. There might be some people that have questions about specific slides. Okay, so I will just open the room as of right now. So if anybody wants to just chime in, I don't foresee it being too big of an issue if you just start talking. If somebody wants to raise hands, or if you want to put it in the chat, and I could just read the question. But let's see. So if anybody just has a question, you feel free. I've got one in the chat that I'll read, but we can just go with if anybody wants to start off. We've got one in the chat. I'll just read that one. Have you explored wetsuits that mimic animal skins?
Oh, no, I have not, but that could be interesting. No, nobody does any animal models. They do animal models. Actually, this is a bit minute, but for surfboard fins, they look at whale fins in order to make them more efficient. But that would be really cool. And I'm going to write that down if you don't mind.
I think from my physiology undergrad days that we are yet to come up with coats that are as good at trapping heat as animal skin, I guess you could say. So that is an interesting.
I do remember actually a wetsuit company on the inner layer. They kind of did they try to make it furry. Personally, I haven't worn them and I don't know how warm they are, but that's the only thing that occurs to me right now.
Okay, we've got, well, this doesn't look like necessarily a question, but it's a compliment, so I'll read it anyway. Really great, excellent role modeling of how to present comprehensive yet most important details in a short period of time. And I would echo that from Stacey.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot going on. It's a little physiology side, so I apologize for that, but there's a little bit of biomechanics. And I think, like I was talking about the dichotomy between thermoregulation and mobility and movement. They're both really important in surfing, but I would say that maybe thermoregulation is a little bit more important than biomechanics. And then one thing is the perceptual data. We're starting to implement how surfers perceive these interventions and maybe other things that are non-wetsuit based. And I think that's something that maybe sports science or any other studies, if they're actually perceiving differences or they're not perceiving differences, is there any point in doing the intervention, maybe in a commercial product or in the sports athlete world?
That might have implications for like motor learning as well. Like if you don't perceive a change, then you don't know if you don't have the feedback to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ty, I don't know a lot about surfing, but you did a really great job presenting.
You know tons now.
Yeah. My born and raised in Nebraska self is not a surfer.
Yeah. Not much exposure to the ocean.
No.
Let's see. Okay, so we also have some more compliments in the chat. I'll let you read. And then there's also a link for the animal skin concept. There's a website that you can check out as well.
Thank you very much.
I just had a question along the lines of the perceptuals. Do you think that these athletes' core temperatures were different between the two wetsuits?
No, I don't think so at all. It's
Or
pretty
would be?
cold, but we don't see that big of a change in core temperature actually when you're paddling in the water. So we only see, off the top of my head with unpublished research, it's maybe 1 to 2 degrees or even if that, maybe even less than that, changes after an hour of paddling.
Mhm.
So I'd imagine that there's no difference between materials in terms of core body temperature.
Gotcha. Is the I suppose, I mean, if you're in somewhere that was really, really cold, then
Mhm.
the drop in skin temperature is still going to be a problem, even if your core temperature doesn't go down.
Yeah, exactly. You'd have blood flow away from maybe the hands. It really starts first in the hands and the feet, and you'll lose sensation and movement.
Sure. I've got a ton of questions, but I'll stop and let other people ask a few. So feel free. Yeah, go ahead. No, I will stop the recording. I don't know if anybody is waiting for me to do that, but I will now stop the recording. So now let's see. Are you sure you want to stop the recording?